Given that lockdown was very nearly ordered on the advice of SAGE last month, it may be worth taking a look at the scenarios that it worked with, that it published, and how they compare to the situation as it actually unfolded. Well, the highest estimated deaths per day, I'm sorry to speak quite so bluntly about this, because if you're one of those people who lost somebody, it's more than a graph, isn't it? But the highest estimated deaths per day was at 4,770, with the, in quotes, best case scenario estimated at a lower figure, but still a massive one, 1,880 deaths per day. But what was the actual figure in reality? It came in at under 200 deaths per day. It raises several questions. One is, if we knew the real world data from South Africa had already shown that Omicron was milder, less likely to lead to fatalities, then how did our modelling prove, as it turned out, so profoundly pessimistic? Well, the statistics expert, the statistician, Jamie Jenkins, joins me. Jamie, welcome to you, and thanks for your time. Appreciate it as ever, and your expertise. There will always be those people who say, better to be pessimistic, surely.
Well, the thing is, Colin, they came up in September, SAGE did actually, and they said, if remember now, I think Boris brought those Plan B restrictions, was the vaccine passes. He brought them in back in towards December, but they were calling back in September of last year, SAGE, that if Boris didn't bring in those restrictions back then, we would see between 3,000 and 7,000 hospitalizations per day. And the reality there was only 700 was kind of the maximum. So when we went then into the Christmas period, I think Michael Gove was saying that he was pushing at Cabinet for further restrictions, looking at these models, and obviously Scotland and Wales did go ahead with further restrictions. And I think there was a bit of a kind of a disagreement at Cabinet, and then the people who want the side of, well, we think the numbers might be a bit out, they kind of won the argument. And as the graph is showing, that they do a range of different scenarios, and the one you just presented, Colin, is the one where they assumed that Omicron would be 50% kind of less severe than the Delta variant that we had before. They assumed around 6 million boosters would be issued per week, I think, by when we go into January. And to be frank, it didn't even stack up when they published it, Colin, because to get anywhere near, say, that higher estimate of 5,000 deaths per day, which Professor Neil Ferguson was talking about, I did some numbers and I wrote a blog on this just before Christmas. You need to get about 1.7 million cases a day, and we get absolutely nowhere near that. So to be frank, the modelers themselves should be looking at the data, looking at their graphs, and the first thing you do is see, is this plausible? And I just don't think they were plausible, even with the scenarios they've come up with.
I remember the conversation just before Christmas that we had, Jamie, and at the time we talked to the South African doctor who was one of the first people on the ground to report what was being seen with Omicron, and she was saying then it's vastly transmissible, it's a lot less lethal. I just wonder, and it's a question I keep repeating, I'm almost beginning to bore myself with it, but I think it's an important one. How do you should you even begin to introduce an element of moral hazard when it comes to modelling? We want our academics, the people who are projecting these things, looking at the data, to feel no political pressure to come up with the model they feel reflects what's likely to happen. However, if it proves to be the case that they are consistently being pessimistic, and that pessimism isn't just academic, it leads to deaths from cancer, mental health, all the other stuff we now know in such profusion, what should we do? We don't need to listen to them. Do we at least say to the ones who consistently get it wrong, thanks for your time, we'll try somebody else next time?
Well, I think we've got to go with the latter there, because as you can see, when you're so far out, if a lot of these people would be kind of sacked, I suppose, if you worked in a private company and you was predicting what kind of the projections for, say, you're working in a company and you want to work out how many sales are we going to have next year, and if you get that completely out, the company might go bankrupt. So you're right, this is people's lives that we're talking about. You have the range that they've got in that chart that you put up, and remember now, we were 93% lower actually than the central estimate, but significantly lower. They were talking potentially just under 2,000 deaths per day if you had the more optimistic scenario, and it's come in at lower than 200. Now, some people would say, Colin, that 200, and I've seen them now saying that Boris shouldn't be easing all the restrictions because 200 deaths per day is a lot. But you're right, we've got to consider everything else, all the other deaths that occur. And at the moment, Colin, I suppose the optimistic thing is that if you look at the number of deaths that the ONS are reporting every single week at the moment, they're no higher than what you'd expect in a normal kind of winter. They're actually lower than 2018, 2017, and 2015. Now, part of that might be because we had a lot of excess deaths through the pandemic, but the figures themselves, when you start looking at on a whole, I think it's more optimistic in terms of easing the restrictions. And I think probably the Prime Minister's headed in the right direction on that.
That's interesting. Jamie Jenkins, as ever, thanks very much indeed for your time.